Hi, everyone. Welcome again to one of our fireside chats. It has been Mobile World Congress week. Hopefully, everyone has had a chance to read some of the crazy announcements that we have seen this week and all of the industry innovation. I'm really happy to have seen a lot of people being able to go there in person and have the opportunity to network. And hopefully next year it's going to go back to normal and enjoy the way we used to. So today we're talking about a topic that it's very close to our heart at Weaver Labs, and it's open source in telecoms. And I am incredibly lucky to have here with me Timo, who's a Chief Technologist for the global telco ecosystem at Red Hat. Welcome, Timo. Thank you very much for being with us today. So a brief introduction about Red Hat. It was born as an alternative to Microsoft, and it offered a community-developed operating system to run in our everyday computers. And it was the first open source company with a business model that surpasses 1 billion revenue. And it has moved on from these enterprise solutions to build, operating systems and sell operating systems to enterprise solutions to offer almost every single tool that now you require to run a cloud infrastructure. And with the softwarization of telecoms and everything moving into the cloud, it was kind of like a no-brainer that Red Hat would start to move into the telecoms world and eventually dominate the market as they are. So Timo, thank you, welcome. And maybe you want to explain us a little bit your role, what you do, and what's the role of Red Hat in telecoms now.
Thanks, Maria, and happy to be here. As you said, I'm Chief Technologist at Red Hat's global telco team, working very heavily with the operators and equipment providers, system integrators, software vendors to bring cloud principles into telco networking with open source primarily because we are open source company, as you said, and really doing that. Now, you started to talk about Red Hat with the Linux distribution, which is exactly true. That's what we did in the beginning, 25 plus years ago started. And Linux distribution is still a very, very important product, open source, 100% open source based product for Red Hat. But we have so many other products developed over these years, of course. Virtualization platform, container platform, software-defined storage, automation tools, we name it, all these things. So we have all these things, but Linux distribution is fundamentally important for us still. Now, Red Hat's role in telecom industry, that's an interesting question, and it makes it very interesting because if you look back for quite a few years, maybe not quite 25 years, but let's say 10, 15 years, Red Hat was no player in telco networking. I mean, no, nothing. Well, some, but very, very little. On the other hand, we have been very visible in telecom or service provider operator company IT side for ages. That's a standard enterprise business, and like in any big enterprises, they use third-party operating systems and all these things. But on telco networking, we were nobody. And we will talk about the network functional virtualization later in this chat, but NFV opened a door for us into telco networking side, in addition to the IT side, because that really started to talk about virtualizing network functions and multi-vendor integration and implementation and all that stuff. So now we are a player in telco networking. We are not a huge player, but I would say we are a big player, an important player after all these NFV years. NFV movement started late 2012, almost 8 years ago. So we are a good and big player in telco networking now.
Yeah, definitely. I think I can see it from coming from research myself and having done quite a bit of work early on in the days, and all these open source solutions that started coming, and all the cloud tools, and then looking at then moving on and looking at the market, how it was trying to struggle to, how do we put all these pieces together? And Red Hat came and said, hey, we know this because we've been in the IT industry for a long time. So all these lessons learned, we can apply in telecoms, right? And that brings me to the next point that I wanted to discuss, which is basically the changes that telecoms is undergoing to adapt to this IT view, right? So the principle here, the headline is telecoms is becoming more IT based and more software based, and we are bringing principles from the Webscale industry, the cloud industry. And one of the things that it struck me from the very beginning is that telecoms has always been heavy in standardization. We have had standardization bodies, multiple of them, and they derive the principles of the next generation of communication standards. Whereas we have seen the Webscale industry and the cloud industry more reliant on the open source and packages of software that the community brings. And the community of open source responds better and faster to the user's needs because it helps find all these interoperable solutions. You have people from their homes trying to, hacking things and trying to make them work. And so it encourages innovation from everywhere, right? While standardization, it's a little bit more difficult to get there. Like if you want to get into 3GPP, you need to be a company, you need to have the necessary capital to get into the meetings. And then we see now a company like Red Hat increasing market share, getting into the telco operators with open source solutions. So what is the value of the industry in telecoms to adopt the principles of the Webscale industry? What can we learn from it and adopting all of these open source solutions?
Yeah. Now, I would like to start this talking a little bit about standardization, because most of the things you mentioned, it's true, but we have to remember that standardization is and continues to be a very, very important building block in telco industry. But we need to make a separation of what technology domains we mean when we talk about standards versus open source. Now, standardization is based on the global interoperability of telco networks. So you have a mobile phone and you can go anywhere in the world and it works. And that is because of the standard. It's not too long ago, I think 2005-ish or something like that, when I had to go to US or Japan, I had to have a phone for that country. Now we don't. So standards will never go, and they never should go away because of these reasons. So the radio interface is one, but there are other to make mobile networks and fixed networks interoperable across the borders globally. So those will not go away. Now, again, the open source and standardization in software stack, that is another story. And again, NFV is a good example because NFV started to horizontalize the network equipment building practices and in horizontal layers. And within that layer, there needs to be some agreements between within the industry and between the vendors, but the strict standardization might not be that important anymore in that domain. The telco standards stay, as I said, but when we think about how to build these things from ground up, of course, we need to have a hardware at the bottom or the base, and then network functions, platforms, tools, management from multiple vendors, which is the key point today. Strict standardization is not that important. We only need to have a common view on open architecture and all these things, and then build in more and more open source based solution. Not everything needs to be open source, but a lot need to be, well, on my opinion, need to be open source, and I have a good reason to say that. But open source also, when we build these things out of open source, they kind of create de facto standards. You know, if you look at the organizations like earlier OpenStack Foundation, Open Infrastructure Foundation nowadays, or ORAN Alliance, or those things, some of the standards and API specifications still need to be there. But open source itself, through the open source upstream communities, they will create de facto standards, which many people have realized during last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years in telco industry that hey, it's actually a pretty interesting model and good model, and maybe I just need to start adopting those de facto standards driven by open source. And that brings, of course, the agility and speed and all these things into this picture. But again, I just want to emphasize that the strict de jure standards and de facto standards through open source, they live nicely together hand in hand in this space.
Absolutely. There is a whole new layer that it's coming on top of the definition of the language that the standards define. Yeah. And then it's about how we build these things, how we put them together, yeah. and how we kind of like mix and match all the different elements of the network. So I like to touch a little bit on the network function virtualization and what it means for the innovation, and also like all these open platforms that you're mentioning, right? So for the audience that it's not telco and so technical in terms of software, the road that 5G has taken us and in general telecommunications is that now all the logic of the network is a piece of software that can run in a server, in a computer, or even in a Raspberry Pi. So it means that we can make a network out of any device that has a CPU. And what it means is that we can have a lot of innovation happening on top of it, right? So whereas before we would have suppliers that would give us the antenna, the core network, which is the logic behind the routers, the gateways, and all of that in hardware that we would just like crafty go and put the cables together. Now we can have a layer on top that we call the automation. And that layer, what it does is from the comfort of your office, allows you to manage the network and build services on top. Yeah. And that is where we are seeing a lot of innovation happening and a lot of new players coming. And as Weaver Labs, we are developing on top, and many people are developing on top. So that's great, because we are increasing the supply chain with solutions, and also the model that you mentioned, it's great for us, because when we come with a management product into the market, knowing that everyone is following the same APIs to connect to the network, it definitely solves our integration problems in terms of the management. So as we see that the telecom world is kind of changing towards that common open platform model, and what would be the implications and what is the value for the traditional mobile network operator that has a network that it's kind of like a mix right now of all of that, and for the traditional vendors, right? One of the big problems that we have had in telecoms was the so-called vendor lock-in problem. So what are the implications for them that have invested a lot of money and time in this industry?
Yeah, so this can be a long story, the whole thing, but I'm going to touch on a very interesting point soon. But if we start with the introduction of NFV again, going back 8 years or so, there was many reasons to do that, and this to be locked into a small number of vendors. That was one of the big reasons. So earlier days, the network equipment in mobile and fixed networks, they were built in by a vendor, from bottom to the top, vertically integrated, many nice, really good technology components embedded, but it was a vertically integrated solution, and which complied to the outside standard interfaces by 3GPP or somebody. So that was the model, and that model was broken intentionally by service providers when introducing the NFV. so that the architecture is horizontal and the technology modules in the horizontal architecture can potentially come from many vendors. Red Hat included on the platform layer, virtualization platform or container platform. So that's the kind of origin of why NFV was introduced earlier. Getting more vendors in and enabling smaller vendors, specifically software vendors, to shine in, which was completely, maybe not impossible, but extremely difficult, at least in earlier days. Now it's a norm. Most of the networks which are being built, they are multi-vendor builds, and shining the big guys, the incumbent equipment providers, have started to play this game quite nicely as well, I have to say. It might have been a bit slow in the beginning, but they are adopting this model, NFV model. And now specifically, when we are moving or have started to move to 5G, that is changing so much, even from standardization point of view towards the software-driven thing. So if you look at what 3GPP has done for 5G standard, which is completely unheard of from 2G, 3G, 4G days, they have started to define software entities and software APIs. And they have adopted, like if you look at the 5G control plane, for example, they have adopted IT Webscale protocol like HTTP2 to connect the control plane entities, software entities, to each other. And those software entities, because they are well defined and the interface is well defined, can come from multiple vendors in multi-vendor integration. And what is very interesting from Red Hat point of view and many other software company point of view in the 5G standard is that they are calling for technologies like containers and microservices and cloud native implementation of network functions. So that, I think that's a good proof point that the standards are still good, because standardization is also now calling for these things. And then, building these things out of open source is going to be a big help and big thing in building the multi-vendor network. And you mentioned this, like Viva Labs, bringing in your own capabilities and competencies in this place. There is again on purpose, introduced a function in 5G network called network exposure function, which is a standard way how the third-party application doing whatever the application might do, have a capability to access internals of the network, like what's happening, getting the monitoring data and other data from the network in a standard way. So this world is really developing into the direction where the Webscale guys have kind of proved a good success and proved success to open interfaces, open up the architectures, open up this and that, and encourage multi-vendor implementations. Now, multi-vendor as such is of course not always very easy. So there has to be somebody who's taking care of integration, who's taking care of putting these things together when they are coming from multiple different vendors. But I think again, the NFV years have been very good years for industry to practice this whole thing. Some project easy, some project not easy. But now moving to 5G, when things are completely different than earlier, that practice period has been very, very valuable for all of us.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And the one thing that I also want to point out is that the fact that everything now it's based on Webscale APIs and using HTTP REST, it makes our life easier to find skill set in and bring it into the telecoms world, because now you have the young generation that, you know, they know how to write APIs, they understand how microservice communication works. So bringing all of that skill set, it's great for us in the telecoms industry, because it's something that we have struggled quite a bit, because every generation we had to do a lot of upskilling. And it was difficult to get all the knowledge there. So now we are diversifying a lot the people that can opt into the telecoms world. So that's also definitely a good point.
It's a good thing. And if I may add one thing, what I just said or what we discussed, you know, these IP protocols like HTTP2 on 5G control plane, that's all true, and that's also fantastic. But we need to remember that when we go down to, we call it user plane, where the end user bits and bytes are delivered from the mobile device to the endpoint, that protocol is still 3GPP protocol and not Webscale protocol. And there was a period of time a few years ago during 5G standardization that how could that kind of oldish tunneling protocol could be replaced finally, because that was originally introduced 1993 for the original GSM, and it has been, you know, it has been adopted 3G, 4G, but it is now in 5G as well, because there was not really a good way to get rid of it, is not a nice way to say it, but
replace it.
Replace it. But you know, there are needs like IP mobility support, charging support, and GTP protocol is doing those things quite nicely. And if GTP would have been replaced by something else, it means that all the devices and everything would have been changed at the same time. So
definitely we need to think about the forward compatibility, the backwards compatibility. And that brings me nicely to the next point that I want to touch, that it's the complexity and making everything work, right? And you touched upon the open interfaces and how we're doing that. So we definitely had this application revolution that Webscale industry revolutionized, and now we have all of those distributed systems. We are undergoing a network transformation as well, with bringing all of those lessons learned and applying the same kind of principles into the software. But there are challenges, and we have seen the Rakuten network, which is a great example of how a network can be created based on cloud with multiple vendors, and by that I mean like multiple equipment coming from different sources, like antenna providers and core network providers. And it has shown the world that it can actually cut costs. I believe I read a Red Hat article that it was a 50% cost on reduction on deployment and operational maintenance of the network, which is huge. It's flexible, it's agile, but these open interfaces are challenging, right? So, I guess the key of it would be working on that, right? As a collaboration. What do you think the key is in terms of reducing that complexity?
Yeah. So first of all, Rakuten is a good example. You know, it's a flagship example of how the networks will be built from now on, I believe. Now, the savings numbers you mentioned, I need to make a point that all the savings numbers we might have in our blogs and everywhere, those numbers are coming from Rakuten. They are Tarek Amin's, their CTO numbers, and if you ask me how they achieve those numbers, I cannot defend them. It's
challenging, right?
Yeah, it's Tarek Amin's and Rakuten's business to challenge, but that's what they are saying, and there's no reason to doubt those things. Now, what is the key? What we have seen in Rakuten, why and how they achieve these numbers, whether the numbers are right or wrong, how they have achieved is a very aggressive automation across the whole network. And as you said, Rakuten build is a really extensive multi-vendor exercise. Initially, when we started that with other partners, there was about 15 different vendors building, bringing in, and now it's 25 if I'm not mistaken. So and the reason it's so heavily multi-vendor is that Rakuten is very strict on not locking them into anybody kind of completely. There's always a bit of lock-in. Nobody can say that it's completely no vendor lock-in, but when you have a good multi-vendor approach and some of the vendors among 25 doesn't perform, it's relatively easy to replace. So now the reason why they get all these savings is the really aggressive automation, as I said. I mean, across the whole network, starting from the remote radio heads through the distributed RAN and all these things. And one thing among many other things, what has made automation, first of all, even possible in Rakuten case, and secondly, has made it eventually fairly easy, is that they are using this horizontal cloud platform all over the places. So when you have a consistent cloud platform and consistent execution environment in RAN, in core and RAN, it's easier to apply automation tools when you have the consistent environment all over the places based on heavy-duty software approach. That's what they did, and that's now kind of they are now getting all the benefits out of that. But again, it hasn't been easy all the time at Rakuten, but
I can imagine. From my experience in building small-scale testbeds based on cloud infrastructure and trying to, integrate things, it has always been a challenge. I do agree that having the good environment and the right environment does help. And now we see, like, for example, in the project that we're doing in Manchester, we are doing a deployment using O-RAN, and that definitely eases the integration of a network that is small, but we have three vendors working with us, which traditionally would have been just one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And O-RAN does help. And when I was chatting to someone from the industry before the event, there was a question that was raised to me that it's about the ownership of O-RAN. And maybe that comes from the thinking of before in the days of telecoms, like there was an ownership placed on things. But what are your views on the ownership of O-RAN and who's going to drive this open interface to interconnect different antennas and make sure that all the vendors can work together?
Yeah. So the history of O-RAN is well known. So there was two major industry alliances before O-RAN. One was called XRAN, which was kind of AT&T and Deutsche Telekom mainly, and some others. And then there was another exercise called CRAN, which was mainly China Mobile. Mm-hmm. And then luckily, these big guys, they decided to combine everything and put O-RAN alliance together. So it is very much operator driven. Mm-hmm. It's not driven by an operator. It's a combination of operators driving the O-RAN alliance. And of course, vendors are chiming in big time, Red Hat included, because the vendors at the end are the people who are implementing what O-RAN wants to happen. And but it's operator led, clearly. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing is there's many interesting things again, but there's still a lot of confusion in the industry on this disaggregated radio access network. So I always want to start with that term, disaggregated radio access network, because again, that is a 3GPP standard, disaggregating the base station to three entities: radio unit, distributed unit, and centralized unit, without any open interfaces, no cloud platform, no nothing. It's just an entity division and disaggregated the radio stack on the base station. Now the confusion is, I find it kind of interesting and funny and sad and all these things combined. because people talk about VRAM, people talk about Cloud RAM, people talk about
Yeah, it's a
people
mess.
talk about ORAM, people talk about whatever RAM, and because of that, I wrote a short Red Hat blog article a few months ago where I try to explain in clear terms what all these different things mean, because they mean different things. VRAM is very different, not very different, but is different than ORAM. Open RAM is different than VRAM. So they are different. They are going together, which is the goal and which is a good thing. But right now they are different. It's not the serious thing. The serious thing is the confusion, because people talk about different things. So I have this easy 10 days read Red Hat blog on explaining what those things are. Now, ORAN is built or established to work on open architecture of disaggregated RAN and standard interfaces between the workloads, between radio and distributed unit, and distributed unit and centralized unit. And also open interfaces. It's not the Azure organization, it's a de facto industry alliance. Building the specifications on, as I said, interface between the workloads and interface specification, how the workloads is going to be managed by an entity called service management and orchestration. And then they have defined in their architecture, they have defined a cloud platform for DU and CU. Radio unit is outside of the scope of cloud platform, but DU and CU. From architectural level, they have defined how the cloud platform fits in to ORAN, and they are not saying it in a very strict way, but it's kind of assumption that the cloud platform is container platform as opposed to virtualization platform. And so that's why ORAN Alliance is very important for Red Hat, because we need to make sure that our container platform OpenShift fits into what the ORAN Alliance wants to have. Yeah.
Again, interoperability and making things
All
work.
these
It's
things.
always the case.
Yeah.
And these platform models kind of bring me to the last point that I wanted to discuss with you before we open it up to the questions. And I wanted to kind of talk about the role of the hyperscalers. And because these open platforms I think it's attractive to some of the likes of AWS and Microsoft Azure, and they have been, investing so much money into this model for the application layer. It was kind of like a no-brainer for them to get into telecoms, and they are disrupting. And do you think that a lot of these Mobile World Congress announcements of operators doing deals with them, it's because they are closer to the application, they are easier to do the edge and bring the application closer to the user? So what's the reason of them being so aggressive and getting so well into the market with the network operators?
So on my opinion, not being a network operator, just to point out, my opinion why operators are very interested about hyperscalers and offloading their network functions and networks to hyperscalers, either hyperscaler software stack on premises or even on public cloud. The reason is a cost saving. That's what operators are after all the time for a reason or another. But there are other reasons as well. And assume that you have a kind of a software-based network running on cloud platform of some kind. It's a very tempting idea to kind of offload some of your functions to public cloud, at least temporarily, when the traffic volume grows. So you can temporarily do that. That was the model a year ago, 2 years ago, that operators used the public cloud providers or hyperscalers to do exactly that. But now, this week, Mobile World Congress week, and just recently, there have been major announcements of completely different thing.
Yeah.
like yesterday, AT&T announced that they will offload their whole network to Microsoft Azure, and Microsoft even acquires their OpenStack assets and start taking care of that and continue to contribute to AT&T's version of OpenStack on behalf of AT&T. That's a major undertaking.
That is a huge change for the telecoms industry.
Oh,
That's why I say I am offloading all of my logic of the network to another company. That is huge. That has never been seen before in this industry.
It hasn't, and only time will tell how successful that will be. So that's a business issue and business decisions why they do that. I understand that, but from technological point of view or technical point of view, it's a very attractive thing, I have to say.
Yeah.
Think about that. You have all these hyperscaler stacks available, kind of all over the places. So why don't utilize those in addition to utilize, stack from other people and own stack on premises? It's a big change, and when somebody can show a major success in doing that, that's going to revolutionize this whole thing even more. But we haven't seen that yet. We are in very, very early phases on that, but major announcements recently, I have to say.
Yeah, and it definitely changed the ownership model. It puts the mobile network operator the idea of maybe I don't have to do the entire investment of the infrastructure by myself. I can use some of this, which is great because we want to see more of that. So I'm just going to open up for 5 minutes the discussion to the audience. And there is one question that I think we have touched upon, but maybe it's not very clear. Will operators begin to work with open source telco solutions anytime soon?
You mean, would they start contributing with them?
Contributing or using them, I guess, being part of the community.
So operators have been using open source. Operators together with their vendors have been using open source for a long time. Not in a major way, but they have. And what we do all the time when we talk to our operator customers or any customers, we always encourage them to kind of start contributing to the same upstream projects, which we are, because that's the way to influence where the upstream project goes, which features are added. So if you invest your engineers or developers, you have a lot saying on where open source goes. But that has not happened yet much. There are exceptions, obviously. There are exceptions, but typically operators do not have software development arm who can do that, but they listen very carefully. When we say that, they listen very carefully because they try to understand this open source model, that how that really works. And so I have been at Red Hat now more than 7 years, and I don't know how many service providers I have met, not everybody, but many. And I'm still struggling to make service providers understand our model, our open source model, which I believe is the right one. People can argue with me, but
it works.
Our model is that we call our development model open source upstream first, which means that every feature which ends up into Red Hat product, it has to be approved in upstream community leaders first. And once that is approved, then we downstream it and put it in our product. So we don't effectively control what we have in our product. That's a thing which many operators have difficulty.
The feature, right? It's
because typically they ask for a feature and the price and when can you deliver? And my answer is that I don't know.
Let's wait for the community to get traction onto it. But that's great. And we see a lot of that happening in the Web3 industry with the decentralized world, everything is driven by the community rather than by the enterprises. So I think it will definitely come. And the open source community leads me to the next question, and it is about the security of these systems, right? So open interfaces, a lot of software vendors working together, interoperability, all of this calls for security chaos. But then the open source community takes good care of the open source. So what are your views on the role of security in telecoms?
So I delivered a pre-Mobile World Congress webinar together with one of our radio partner, Altiostar, on this topic, security, specifically related to open interfaces, disaggregation, open source, all these things, and our view definitely is that open source as such is not opening up any new security problems. Neither do open interfaces, because open interfaces can be defined so that the security is taken care in the beginning with all the encryption and whatever you might have, and then related to ORAN. So as I said, as we know, ORAN model is disaggregating the base station into smaller entities. So if you find a security flaw in an entity, it's easier to fix because the entities are smaller. You only have to fix.
Good point. That's a really good point.
A small piece, not the whole thing. And again, open source model is that everybody sees everything. So there is so many pair of eyes looking at the code all the time and fixing the security and any other bugs very quickly, I have to say.
That's great. So I think that is my favorite answer in terms of the security aspect of telecoms. It's definitely something that we are looking at from the zero trust approach, trying to reduce that perimeter model so that every single of these disaggregated entities belongs to it's like its own trust domain.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's great to see so much innovation happening in that world of cybersecurity and getting closer to the telecoms world, mainly because of softwarization. Yeah. So to close off our chat, I would like to ask you a question that I always ask, and it's like, where do you see the innovation going? Where do you see the next 10 years of telecoms, and what would excite you to see?
So that's a big question, but just to answer it partially, we see open source and open source platforms and cloud platforms. We call them platforms for innovation or innovation platform, because they enable and allow people to innovate, because everything is open. You can propose things and stuff into this environment. So we really call those platform for innovation. Now, 10 years, to be honest, well, I do care, but I'm not going to be in this job in 10 years. I'm that old person, but maybe I'll start doing some 6G research or something like that. I don't know.
That's definitely interesting.
It's difficult to predict one year from now, not to talk about 10.
It's good. It keeps us excited, and it keeps the industry moving, which is something that we are really happy to see, because with all these changes, we wouldn't have been able to have this conversation, which I have found so insightful, and I hope everyone else has. Timo, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we've touched very important points. We've stayed very much in the surface of everything that is going on, but thank you.
Pleasure, and it was fun as well.
Thank you so much. Well, everyone, thank you for joining. Any questions you may have, just drop them into the chat, and I can make sure that it's going to be answered. Bye.
All right.